Good morning, everybody. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to this conference. I'm Rosemary Scanlon. I'm the interim dean of the Schack Institute of Real Estate this month, or for the last several months. And normally I am a professor of economics and the academic affairs director. So we're so pleased about this conference. This is our second year for this conference. We have Constantine Contacosta to thank for setting this up, and just a little bit about Constantine. If there was ever an equal opportunity student, it's Constantine. He has his undergraduate degree in engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. He has at least one, if not two, master's degrees from Columbia, then another master's from the Schack Institute of Real Estate, and then he went back to Columbia for his PhD, and then we got him back. So we're just thrilled, and Constantine has opened up this whole new area of sustainable development for us, and you can read some of the details in his bio in the program. But we're very pleased with this program. We think it's going to be a great day, and I won't talk any longer. I just want you to know that we're happy that you're here, and I'm going to introduce Constantine and bring him up to start the program. Oh, there's one more thing I have to say, or I won't be able to go back to the office, and that is we're live on Facebook, and we are tweeting on Twitter, right? And here's the code. It's SBE 2012. Okay.
Thank you, Rosemary. That was much too modest. As interim dean, you've got to be a better salesperson for the Schack Institute. You know, push us a little bit. So I'll have to follow up with some of that later on, I think. Well, it's a pleasure. I'm really glad you're all here to share the second annual conference with us. Some of you are returning guests from last year, so it's good to see some familiar faces. It's quite a day. I think it's one of these days that if you didn't have concerns about some climate change, the NYU students sunbathing right down there in Washington Square Park this morning might make you have a few concerns. Before we get started, I would like to just say a special thanks to some key people who really made all of this possible. First and foremost is our co-chairs and my co-chairs for the conference, Relina Bolkandani from Cisco, Susan Leeds from New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, and Chuck Leitner of what is now ULI Greenprint Center and also of REEF. So they were just all instrumental in pulling all this together, having us have a cohesive agenda and a cohesive and wonderful group of speakers to work with. I would also like to thank our sponsors, because really that made all of this very much possible. First and foremost is our kind of, we'll call it a long-time sponsor because it's been 2 years now. So the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors has been a fantastic friend in bringing this together. RICS, if you don't know the organization, you can certainly learn more about it right behind here. It's a fantastic organization for people involved with land, property, and construction surveying, and construction cost estimating. It's really a preeminent organization in the world. Another group I'd like to thank is the Urban Systems Collaborative. So this is an emerging network of like-minded, in some ways, professionals from very differing backgrounds who are looking to use data and analytics to improve the development and planning and operations of cities. So it's a fantastic organization as well. It's a very much, in some ways, grassroots, despite the presence of some very large organizations within that network. But I encourage you to find out some more about that as well. And I also like to thank Cushman & Wakefield, Capsis Corporation, and the Office of Sustainability, and a number of our promotional partners who helped get the word out about all of this. Just to give a brief background on the center, just a little bit, I guess my sales pitch for the center. We're only about 2 years old, so our mission has really been to provide a kind of a multidisciplinary platform to really figure out ways to foster innovation and advance sustainability in urban sustainability, to advance urban sustainability and transformation in real estate markets. And we're doing this through 3 ways. So one of our keys is applied research. So taking some of this, the theoretical knowledge that's out there, some of the key cutting-edge research, but translating it so that it's applicable to actually have people improve the way they make decisions, and that's a key theme for today. We do it through our education program, so we now actually, as of last year, introduced a Sustainable Development concentration in our Master of Science in Development degree, which is a really exciting new initiative. It's one of our most popular, and it's attracting some fantastic students several of whom are here today, with backgrounds that you might not expect coming into a real estate master's program, from environmental sciences, ecology, people coming in with master's degrees in urban planning, so it's a fantastic mix. And last, of course, with events like this. So we have our conference, we have a speaker series that we run every semester. We've got a graduate student competition that ran last year around this time and will be running in the fall. So please keep an eye out for that. And we've been working, again, as I said, on some of the key areas of research, working with some major agencies, both public and private. Right now we're doing a major study with New York City, looking at all the local Law 84 data, which you'll hear a bit more about this afternoon. Working with the United Nations Environment Program, a bit with, and been involved with things like the New York City Urban Technology Innovation Center. So it's been a busy 2 years, it's been exciting 2 years, and it's great to be back here with you. Today focusing on what is a critical topic. And today we're really focused on the role of data and information and how we get to market transformation in real estate capital markets and real estate investment decision making. For those of you who've been following a lot of this, you'll recognize that there's now a tremendous amount of information, and I think out there regarding building performance, whether it be energy, water consumption, waste, any number of kind of issues that are now becoming available. We now have the ability to begin to measure and record and collect this information. But one of the problems we've been facing, of course, is that I think the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, was referring to it must have been some statistician who came up with that. I don't know the exact lineage. But the problem is that there's so much information. We need to understand what to collect, how best to collect it, how to analyze it, how to disseminate it, and then, of course, how to make the different stakeholders, the end users, whether it be a tenant, an owner, an investor, a lender, even a community group, better understand how to make decisions with that information. And that's really what the challenge is today. And that's really what the challenge is for us going forward. So it's really this question of access to information, so the transparency of the information, collecting the information, the analytics behind it. So how do we begin to analyze it to make better sense of it? And then, of course, how do we translate it and communicate it to a number of stakeholders to actually make better and improve decisions? And improve decision making so that we're starting to worry about social impacts, resource efficiencies, and how we make our investment decisions. So that the financial number is not necessarily the bottom line, that we actually get to the point where we're adding those triple bottom line, those other two bottom lines that everybody keeps talking about. So how do we actually make that business case? We're starting to have the data and information to go for that. Just to give one example, perhaps, of a practical example of how that plays out is really, I think everybody's been aware of the calorie counting or the calorie labeling for chain restaurants in New York City. It's a perfect example of how providing information, collecting information, providing usable metrics, and getting that information out to the public can change how people make decisions. If you look at Starbucks, once the calorie counts requirements came out, they immediately changed their ingredients, changed their portion sizes, changed their menus of what they're able to offer in their stores. So the producers changed that because they knew they were being watched. And they knew that the consumers were paying attention because the consumers could go in, they had a recognizable metric in terms of the number of calories, and they had a standard to go against. So they knew that they should be consuming about 2,000 calories a day. So they could understand how to make decisions. And I don't know about you, but when I go into Starbucks now and I'm hungry, more than often I reach for the banana because the bear claw at 500 calories is probably not the best choice. So I've changed my decisions, but I think that's the power of information and data effectively communicated will change how producers, so in this case the owners, the investors, make decisions in real estate, and of course how the tenants are making decisions as well. And this will really drive demand and shape and change the importance of this information and data going forward. We have a fantastic lineup today of panels. I think that's obvious. I think that's why you're all here. We start with looking at the public policy issues around this, energy disclosure laws, how we balance voluntary and mandatory reporting requirements, what kind of information we're looking for, how do we collect it, and how do we present it. The second panel really focuses on data and IT issues, so really much more on the technological advances in terms of not only what's out there in terms of the data sets that are available, but what kind of information we can collect and what we could do with it. And then after lunch, we'll talk more about the financial side, so financing mechanisms to improve building retrofits and actually make some improvements in our building stock. And then, of course, getting to the heart of the matter, which is there really this link between investment performance and energy performance? And if so, why? What are the drivers of that, and how do we enhance that link? So I'm very pleased to kick us off today to have Richard Kaufman, Senior Advisor to Secretary Chu at the Department of Energy, leading us off today. Richard joined the department relatively recently, September 2011, but brings with him an incredible background in the private sector, looking at this exact question of how you match energy efficiency and investment decisions, and how you make investments around energy efficiency. Prior to joining the Department of Energy, he served as CEO of Good Energies, which is, as many of you know, a leading investor in renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. He was also a partner of Goldman Sachs, where he chaired the Global Financing Group and served as a member of the firm's Partnership Committee, Commitments Committee, and Investment Banking Division Operating Committee. And before joining Goldman, he served as vice chair of Morgan Stanley's institutional securities business and co-head of its banking department. He's also served on the as chairman of the board of Levi Strauss & Co. and sits on the board of several nonprofits as well, including the Brookings Institution and the Foreign Policy Association. He has his bachelor's from Stanford and 2 masters from Yale University. It's a great pleasure for us to have Richard here. He has spent a career trying to figure out and actually implementing what we're trying to talk about today. And I can think of no one better to kick us off and set the stage for the afternoon today. So I'd like to welcome Richard Kaufman, please.
Well, thanks very much, Constantine. That's much more about me than even I want to know. Is it possible I can move this? All right, I'll do the best I can. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground, and some of the stuff that I'm going to cover, particularly at the beginning, most of you know. But I am going to take us to a couple of different places, and I'm going to be controversial in a couple of spots. So let's see how we do during this ride. So my background is in finance. As Constantine said, I've only been there a few months. So I haven't been in Washington so long to have forgotten the power of markets. And like all of you in this room, when I see energy efficiency, I see market failure, and only a tiny percentage of buildings in the United States have been retrofitted. So everybody knows all the reasons I think that economists give as to why there's market failure in energy efficiency, and I won't go into all those. But as a financial guy, I can tell you that the biggest obstacle, I think, to unleashing the market is finance. Meaning that if we can find ways to get money to fund energy efficiency projects, entrepreneurs will find ways to solve most of the other obstacles. And the irony is that energy efficiency projects can generate attractive cash yields at a time when investors, and I'm not talking about real estate investors, I'm talking about retail investors, institutional investors, are starved for yield because their choice is to either invest in a volatile stock market or bonds which have interest rates close to zero. So a whole series of obstacles prevent money from flowing where it's needed, where it can pay the rate of return investors would love to have. And the good news is that none of the obstacles we see in financing are insurmountable. In one way or another, they've been addressed in other markets. And so that's part of what I think you're trying to do today. What are some of the obstacles preventing private sector capital to flow? So this is the first controversial thing I'm going to say, because it relates to a structural observation, is that I don't think, this is my own view, not the view of the Department of Energy of the U.S. government, that banks are probably not the long-term answer for financing energy efficiency, for the simple reason that many energy efficiency loans are small and proposed reserve capital rules for banks are high. So the combination means that banks will continue to make larger and safer loans. The amount of capital, this is a banking thought, the amount of capital a bank needs to put up against a small energy efficiency loan will simply not make the loan economically attractive to the bank. So in the past, there were what were called non-bank finance companies that provided specialized lease or asset-based lending, but many of these are either shadows or their former selves or have gone out of business. So one of the things that the financial crisis has generally done is to have starved credit for smaller loans of all sorts and I'm afraid that energy efficiency loans are not going to be put on bank balance sheets. Local and community banks can be an exception to the rule, but the amount of capital which they can deploy can't provide the amount of can't provide either the quantum or the low-cost debt capital markets can potentially offer. So that's the first controversial point, as I say. So if banks aren't going to be the answer to providing private sector financing, then who will it be? And so I think the answer is the capital markets, institutional and retail investors who will be interested in buying securities that offer attractive yields. And, you know, we see this going on at different states. States have begun initiatives to issue bonds. Delaware issued bonds to finance energy retrofits in state buildings, and Pennsylvania has been working with other states on a securitization idea for residential energy efficiency loans. So it's not hard to see the future, or a future, where state green banks or private sector banks originate loans, package them together, and sell the loans as bonds, right? That would be a capital market solution. It also sounds a lot like the mortgage finance business, and so we need to be think ahead about ways to ensure that the excesses of the mortgage business do not occur in the energy financing business. But the upside of attracting bond investors is a big prize. To tap bond investors, to create a securitized bond market, in order to do that, several underlying capabilities need to be put in place. And at the center of these capabilities are metrics. To attract investors, there needs to be enough empirical evidence on risk. There also needs to be standardized contracts of all sorts, as much as practicable. And so the data and the metrics, you know all this already, has to be cost and performance of energy retrofits projects. Manufacturers need to provide more than guarantees. They need to give actual performance data, not just guarantees on how the equipment operates. They need to give actual performance data on how pieces of equipment actually perform over time. And too many manufacturers really would prefer to compete on the basis of closed architecture. So data needs to be collected on customer payments, on lease rates and sales prices before and after retrofits. You know all this stuff. But in building performance, data has to be robust, taking into account weather conditions and changing building usage. So there's a recent company in Washington, D.C. that installs solar hot water heater, and they found out that in Washington, D.C., the intake of water can vary as much as 20 degrees in different buildings. So if you're going to measure the data on the performance of solar hot water retrofit, you better know what the input water temperature is. Insofar as possible, contracts and data need to be common and comparable across states. And then at some point, we're going to need to have aggregation entities to be established that can accumulate loans and package them for sales to investors. So again, you can see sort of the outlines of all this stuff. And the purpose of today is to go deeply into these questions of metrics and the relationship between data and capital markets. So DOE is delighted to have the opportunity to participate today in your event, and a couple of my colleagues will give you more details on what we're doing to advance the cause. So since we are in the business of making some commercials, I just want to say a couple things on what DOE is doing on the data front. So in this past December, Presidents Obama and Clinton announced the Better Buildings Challenge, which brought together over 60 CEOs. The challenge part, I think, of the Better Buildings Challenge to the CEOs is to measure their current energy consumption and execute programs that will result in a 20% reduction by 2020. And it's not just to improve the performance of in these buildings, but it's also to include data collection and management tools that will help building owners while collecting data in standardized forms to a national scale database. So what we're trying to do is to help build a underlying data infrastructure, not just for these buildings, but can be used broadly. And so this is what I call the Better Buildings Data Challenge. Sort of fits into a broader initiative on building data that is part of C-Action. That's an acronym that stands for the State and Local Energy Efficiency Action Network. And this this network helps states, utilities, and other local stakeholders take energy efficiency to scale. So DOE is building a database on various factors that affect a building's performance, such as energy, materials, and land use. The database has information from buildings from around the world, ranging from homes and commercial interiors to large buildings and even whole campuses and neighborhoods. And you'll hear more about this database and how you can make it more useful later this morning from Cody Taylor. Now, here's the next controversial thing I'm going to say. Even if we do a great job in collecting financial and energy data on building performance, we may not have done enough to unleash the market for energy efficiency. So this is where I'm going to tell you a story about cakes, and more specifically about instant cakes. So the instant cake mix was invented by Betty Crocker Company after World War II. A lot of women had been in the workforce, and so the Betty Crocker Company thought it'd be really great, since women were busy, because it was obviously women, that to come up with a cake mix that would be easy to make. So, like a lot of leading companies, they developed the product, and they had a focus group. They brought a bunch of women into Betty Crocker conference room and asked them to try the recipe, and asked them, was it easy to make? And I said, yes, it was easy to make. Did it taste good? Yes, it tasted great. Would you buy it? Yes, we'd buy it. So they put it out in the stores, and nobody bought the product. So the company took the product off the shelves, tinkered with the packaging, tinkered with the recipe, did more focus groups. Does it taste good? Yes. Is it easy to make? Yes. Would you buy it? Yes. Put it back in the store. Nobody bought it. So this went on for several iterations. And same thing kept occurring. And they were about ready to give up on the product until somebody figured out that it really wasn't about what the cake tasted like or how easy it was to make, that it was really about mom and love. And that's why, if any of you have ever made an instant cake mix, you add an egg. Because you could use a powdered egg. But the act of adding the egg meant that mom was making the cake. And that was what made the product successful. So, what does that story have to do with anything? Least of all what we're talking about here. Well, the cake story is why customers buy things. They don't usually buy things because of the explicit product or service attributes, the left side of the brain, so to speak. Buying behavior comes from what's inside somebody, their feelings or their instincts, the right side of the brain. I wanted to tell the story because I don't think that those of us involved in energy efficiency have adequately thought about buying behavior. What motivates customers to buy energy efficiency? Nor do I think we've thought enough about the groups of people that share the same kind of buying motivation, what marketers call market or customer segmentation. The point of the story is that what determines buying behavior isn't that the cake is easy to make or that energy efficiency pays for itself. Customers buy particular goods or services, including energy efficiency services, because of how satisfied they feel. Not all of us have the same buying motivations or the same feelings. The job of marketers is to come up with market segments that represent different kinds of buyer motivation. When I talk about market segmentation, I'm not talking about market classification. The usual way I hear about prospective energy efficiency customers talks about certain categories: owner-occupied, lease commercial, multifamily residential, MUSH, and so on. These are market classifications. They are not market segmentation. It's not market segments. Market segmentation relates to buying motivation of individuals involved in making a buying decision. Market segmentation aggregates individuals who are looking for the same attributes in a product or service. Consumer companies are really great at market segmentation. Service companies in general aren't very good at it, haven't considered haven't considered segmenting in the market, and I put energy efficiency services, including financing, into the category of service entities that haven't adequately thought about market segmentation. So there are a couple of problems that emerge without adequately addressing market segmentation. The first, it's expensive for startup organizations with limited resources to get to scale because customer acquisition costs are high. So any of you that have worked with small startup entities know what I'm talking about. So without targeting buying behavior, conversion rates are really low, and it's a hit or miss proposition. So most startup companies are going to run out of cash because customer acquisition costs are too high. So at virtually every level of the energy efficiency market, it's immature and needs to get to scale, and therefore it's crying out for segmentation as a means of allocating scarce resources to get the market to scale. The second problem that emerges because of inadequate market segmentation is that it's hard to make sense of all the great innovation that we see going on everywhere in the energy efficiency front. We know there are 27 different PACE programs alone. There are green banks, there are specialized muni financing, and from there, ESCOs, and on and on and on. So how do all these things fit together? Are these different approaches competitive or complementary? I've been in many meetings where the sponsors of different initiatives and programs act as though they were in a religious debate as to which program is the answer to solving the problem of energy efficiency. What I'd like to do this morning is to use the framework of market segmentation to put the question of metrics into a broader framework. So let's go back to the cake story for a minute and think about energy efficiency from the standpoint of the buyers and how they feel. How might we segment the market into different kinds of buyer motivation? And what kind of additional metrics might help us with each segment? So I've just made up 5. I'm not a marketer, I'm a finance guy. So perhaps these will trigger some in all of you. And remember, we're talking about what motivates individuals to buy something. So the first segment might be, make it easy for me. This kind of consumer doesn't want to know much, doesn't want to know the details of the equipment that will be installed, how much it'll cost, who will do what. This consumer, and it could be a residential or commercial or industrial customer across any of these classifications, right? It's about the person. Simply wants a single service provider to take care of all the details of the energy efficiency plan, executed and monitored. You can see why ESCOs are successful in dealing with this type of customer segment. However, you can see why the make it easy for me customers have zero interest in different state programs or city programs to provide technical assistance or information on what these customers can do for themselves. They don't want to do it for themselves, right? The kind of data that, that this segment might be interested in is data that emphasizes the quality of service of providers. Were installation times of projects on time? Was performance delivered as promised? What about ongoing service satisfaction measures? We also have to figure out data how to find these customers. So there's another data set to find. It'd be useful to know what other services a prospective purchaser of energy efficiency outsources. Do they outsource IT or HR services? If they do, it's probably a good bet that this prospect is a candidate for make it easy for me energy services. All right, the second segment might be, I want to do it myself, right? The do-it-yourselfer. This segment has no interest in the make it easy for me model since it appears opaque. These kind of customers want to know details, want to be in charge, are suspicious that broad service models disguise how much money is being made at each step of the process. And again, the segment cuts across residential, industrial, commercial customers. It's about buying behavior. The do-it-yourselfer is kind of a general contractor type that wants to assemble the pieces, oversee the work, and do the ongoing monitoring of the program, and will want to count the pennies along the way. ESCO models don't usually serve this market segment very well. Well, actually, this is a kind of customer segment that likes technical assistance and information. The do-it-yourselfer is going to be focused on very specific data on individual service providers and equipment performance, and on data that shows interoperability between systems. You know, and so we know that this segment is going to want a lot of data, but if we're going to try to find this person, it'd be nice to know if this person shops at Home Depot, right? All right, third market segment. I'm conservative, and I'm not talking about the Tea Party, right? This segment is nervous about things going wrong. These are the same people who once bought IBM mainframe computers in the 1960s and 70s because they were safe choices. They didn't want to be yelled at by their bosses, and they were afraid of buying foreign cars because they were afraid they'd break down. They tend not to be early adopters. So in my prior life, we invested in a small company that offered 20% energy efficiency in air conditioning and refrigeration through a simple retrofit of a valve. So not surprisingly, the company targeted grocery chains that use a lot of AC and refrigeration. So the company's technology works, but the company has not been successful because the risks to the store manager were asymmetrical. Sure, the device would save money, but what if the AC and refrigeration broke down? What would a guarantee mean from a small company? So this is a really reflects conservative market segment, and I think that this segment wants to see a market develop, and then they'll follow. This is a group that will want to see longitudinal data on performance and data on what has gone wrong. What is the length of downtime on repair, and how does it compare to pre-retrofit service standards? How about comfort efficiency? One of the reasons I think energy efficiency has had slow adoption, I suspect, is because the conservative segment is actually quite large. This group will want to have a big name to stand behind it if something goes wrong. So, fourth segment, I'm an innovator. This segment may feel that they're on the cutting edge, that they're making a difference in the world, that they want their kids perhaps to feel proud of what they do. They may feel that they will advance their careers by taking a chance. These customers are the early adopters, the one who work with new business models, figure out new financing structures, or work with startup service providers. These innovators, in fact, or at least a segment of these innovators, may be the ones who are most concerned about non-energy data. What about employee morale, as measured by sick days or turnover? We know that researchers such as Dr. Francis Kuo at the University of Illinois have carried out a number of experiments about green buildings and positive impacts on physical and mental health. But given that not all retrofits may be green, will data show negative effects on health from some kinds of retrofits? Are there ways to measure brand benefits from working in greener buildings? Is the building advertised as being green? The fifth market segment is I hate utilities. And this is not my view. This is a market segment, okay? I want to make that clear. This group dislikes monopolies, feels that utilities are slow-moving, expensive, and not responsive to customers or to innovation. The segment hates feeling that there's no choice and dislikes being dependent on an entity that charges for unreliable service. So the data here may relate to whether the customer segment has renewable on-site or purchases power from independent power providers. That's a good way to find this kind of market segment. Another data question this customer may have in looking at other projects may relate to whether an energy retrofit, for example, has taken steps to rewire the building for DC, or whether they've installed devices to improve quality of power. Customers with lots of electronic equipment often hate utilities because of frequency problems. So collecting frequency data might help them too. So again, there are a couple of takeaways from this detour into market segmentation. First, certain service models serve some market segments and not others. And second, when you hear about what seem to be competing solutions, often, again, advocated by people who are convinced that they found the single answer to solving energy efficiency, think about whether or not what they're in fact talking about is addressing different market segments. And third, when we think about metrics, we want to think broadly about collecting data that will be useful in serving each market segment. So perhaps put most simply, if we want to solve the problem of energy efficiency, we first need to start from the customer. We need to develop a market for it first. In order to develop a market, we need customers to buy it. And customers come down to what motivates individual buying behavior. We need to start with the customer, deliver a service that each segment wants, and each service model will need its own data to support it. So part of what customers want is financing choice. In the US, we give most purchasers of capital goods two basic choices of how to finance it: lease or buy on credit. You can get a loan or lease a car, rent or buy a house with a mortgage, the same choice for a piece of equipment or an aircraft. So we can look, there are a bunch of different examples across different states. So there are many different financing models. So how do they fit into the puzzle? What are best? And so the answer, as you can guess, it depends on market segmentation. Most, but not all, of the Make It Easy for Me customers will want a lease type structure, since it'll fit their desire to have as little to do with the project as possible. But certainly all will want to have a financing structure that minimizes the number of checks that have to be written or the pieces of paper they'll need to sign or fill out. The PACE warehouse or bond structure is a probably better fit for the Make It Easy customer than an owner arranged model. And so not surprisingly, the do-it-yourself model will evaluate the financing options and choose between a purchase or lease for financing. And the conservative market segment will want financing structures that involve little risk and has been well established by others. So to make the point again, we need to start with a service model of energy efficiency that fits what each customer segment wants, and then work backwards to different financing structures that also fit each segment. So what I hope you've taken away from what I've said so far are a couple of things. The first is a way to make sense of the various financing and service model initiatives that have arisen across the US. You can place the different initiatives into this framework of market segmentation. Let's get away from religious debates about a single answer to solving energy efficiency and understand that different answers are right for different market segments. What I tried to do this morning is to lay out a broad framework of where we ought to go and how the pieces that have been developed so far fit together. We need to start with what motivates different segments of energy efficiency customers, what's going to motivate them to buy, and use segmentation to help the industry get to scale. Segmentation is the quickest way to get the industry to scale, since it targets specific services to specific types of customers. We need to offer lease and buy financing options, since different segments will want to finance energy efficiency services their own way. But irrespective of the type of finance offered to customers, the financing can be financed by issuing securities to investors, and whether it be a lease, a municipal bond, or a bond issued by a bank or an ESCO, it needs to rest on a common platform of capabilities and a common infrastructure. Underlying each of these steps is data, is metrics. We need metrics to better identify customer segments, to provide metrics to serve each customer segment. Some customers will care about certain data more than others, and we need common types of data to help create financing structures that will permit capital market solutions. So there's really a lot to do, and so all I have to do is just keep figuring out how to add the egg. So thanks very much.
I'd like to welcome our first panel to the stage. I'll introduce Laurie briefly. So Laurie Kerr is a senior policy advisor at the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. I'm sure many of you in the room know of her or know of her work. She was instrumental in creating Plan NYC and now has been leading the charge on the Greener Greater Buildings Plan and the work around specifically Local Law 84, so the energy disclosure data. So it's been a pleasure to be working with her over the past few months on analyzing some of this, and I will turn it over to Laurie once everyone is settled in.
That was a great introduction, but a difficult one to follow, I think, because it was so nuanced. I think we're going to move into what we're doing in New York, and before I give a capsule of what's happening here and then open it up to the panel, I want to just give very, very brief introduction. Rebecca Kraft leads Con Edison's energy efficiency group. Mark Allen Hughes is a distinguished professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the director of the policy part of the Greater Philadelphia Innovation Project. Cliff Majersik is the executive director of the Institute for Market Transformation in Washington, who has helped a lot of cities, including New York, in efforts to broaden benchmarking. And then finally, Ron Piester hails from Albany. He's the head of the New York State Department of State's code efforts in Albany. So a varied and knowledgeable panel. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what we've been doing here in New York to set the stage for some of the questions. 5 years ago, Mayor Bloomberg launched Plan YC, which is a comprehensive plan for sustainable growth for New York City through 2030. It's a very bold, broad, and ambitious plan, has 10 major goals from housing to better transportation to a culminating goal of a 30% carbon emissions reduction citywide for New York City by 2030, along with also reliable clean energy for New York City. So it's these last two goals that really touch on what we're going to talk about today. So when we started on this, we had to see where our emissions were coming from, and we found out that in New York City, 75% of our emissions carbon emissions that is, come from energy used in buildings. So that focused the mind very keenly. More than that, we found that 85% of those emissions would come from buildings that we already have because of looking at our growth rate. So by 2030, those emissions would come primarily from buildings we already had in 2005. So we began to launch a series of very comprehensive efforts on energy efficiency. The city's own portfolio is reducing its emissions by 30% in 10 years, an accelerated goal on that. We've laid out a challenge to universities and hospitals. NYU is one of the leading universities, having achieved almost a 30% reduction, or maybe having crossed the finish line already in 3 or 4 years. And we have launched an effort to green all of the city's codes. Almost 30 of those proposals have already passed or been enacted. But the signature effort that we've launched, and probably the most well-known, is the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, which is 4 interrelated laws plus a financing piece and an education effort. Those sets of laws target the city's largest buildings. There are 1 million buildings in the city of New York. Impossible problem logistically. But we found that 50% of our square footage is housed in less than 2% of those buildings, 16,000 properties. And so those properties, those ones over 50,000 square feet, are the ones that we have targeted with the Greener Greater Buildings Plan. And that effort broadly includes 3 requirements for energy transparency and 2 requirements for energy efficiency upgrades broadly within those 16,000 properties. I'm only going to go into the benchmarking piece, which is one of the first pieces to have come into effect. Requirements in New York City are for annual benchmarking of energy and water use in these largest buildings, which will ultimately be publicly disclosed. The city started its own benchmarking 2 years ago. It already has 2 years of data. That information is already on a public website. You can look it up for every one of those 2,700 buildings, as well as there's a report that's been issued. And to our dismay, we found that New York City's buildings are average. New York government buildings were not as unique as we'd thought, but our average, looking at the whole portfolio, is about 51, which actually gives a lot of credence to the portfolio manager metric, that portfolio of broad portfolio of buildings, before much work had been done, really is sitting very comfortably at the national average. So we're gearing up for the 3rd year of benchmarking of those buildings, and then private sector buildings, of which there are 14,000 properties, roughly 24,000 buildings. It's kind of the Costco of energy. New York City statistics always sound like Costco. We have 2.5 billion square feet of space housed in these buildings that are being benchmarked. So where are we? We just completed the 2nd year of benchmarking, the 1st year of private sector benchmarking. The deadline was December 31st. We have about an 80% compliance rate, which is extremely high. Why is that? We did extensive outreach. We were considerably helped by Con Ed, which provided aggregated data so that buildings could get all of their electricity data from one place. And we found that in terms of Richard's market segmentations, that New York City building owners are not do-it-yourselfers. About 60% of those benchmarking scores were done by the consultant community. So they, I think, viewed benchmarking as a kind of lost leader for the other greener, greater building plan efforts. And so that makes it fairly easy for us to also improve accuracy, because this is being done by a professional group, a small group, in whose interest it is to be known as doing an accurate job. So that's one of the things that we've seen so far. Further analysis is being done by Constantine here at NYU and David Sue at University of Pennsylvania, and a report on this will be issued in the middle of April. We've begun the 2nd year of benchmarking for private sector. This fall, the commercial buildings scores will be publicly posted. The following fall, the residential buildings. So the big picture here in New York is that we're quickly moving from an era in which energy efficiency was hampered by a lack of data because it was so diffuse and opaque, to a moment where we're going to have a lot of data. We realize that it's not just benchmarking data, that we can have a lot of information from the audit and retrofit requirement that's also part of the audit and retro commissioning requirement that's also part of the Greener Greater Buildings Plan. And we're going to collect that electronically, marry that to the benchmarking data, and get a lot deeper information about our building stock and how it uses energy. And we have also started to partner with Cody and his group at Department of Energy to start to make those energy data systems broadly usable across the country, and accommodating of even more types of information, such as pre and post retrofits, financing information, and so forth. Point of view of New York City, we're on a cusp of a real transformation from a moment of real opacity to a moment of real transparency and knowledge. With that, I'm going to open up to the panel. What really is the value of all this benchmarking data? And I think I want to ask Cliff and Rebecca perhaps to field that.
Well, I think the value is huge. As many of you in the real estate industry know, you compete on what is measured. You can't manage what you don't measure. And right now, around the country, around the world, how energy efficient a building is largely unknown. You know how much you pay for energy bills, perhaps, and actually, in many cases, very few people know that. Very few people in the building know how much is actually being paid for energy bills. But you don't have a sense, is that good or is that bad? If you're a tenant looking for a new space, you don't know, and typically tenants will pay a large portion of the energy costs. You don't know if the buildings that you're looking at are going to be efficient and you'll have low energy costs, or inefficient, you'll have high energy costs. Now that's beginning to change with things like Energy Star and USGBC's LEED program, which are voluntary programs and very good at highlighting the best, but relatively few buildings have earned a LEED certification or an Energy Star plaque, and for those buildings you don't really have any information about how good they are. And I like to use the analogy of cars. Imagine if you were going to buy a car and you didn't know whether you were buying a Hummer or a Prius. There was no mile per gallon sticker. You couldn't tell from looking at it. And in that situation, you probably wouldn't pay extra for a Prius because you wouldn't know what you were getting. If, in that situation, if people wouldn't pay extra for a Prius, but if a Prius cost a little bit more to make it more energy efficient, you could imagine that manufacturers would be making those Priuses. Given the lack of transparency in the building sector now, I think it's amazing that we have as many good buildings as we have. And I think that the power of having this data, allowing markets to properly function with the good data that they need, I think it will unleash a lot of private investments in improved building operations and retrofits. And in fact, my group is in the process of doing an estimate of what the national impact of something like Local Law 84 across the country would be. And our estimate, and we have an advisory panel that's been helping us with all the assumptions that go into it, is that you could see more than $40 billion in energy savings across the country by 2025. So, just under $40 billion by 2025. If you had laws like that in place around the country starting today. So we think that this is a really big deal.
I guess, there are two things I would sort of question in your question, which is, value to whom? And it may be indeed that for landlords who can say they have a high score, they may be able to extract value from the marketplace, and that's fine. And then what is it you're measuring? So, Cliff says, and we would certainly agree, what you can't manage what you don't measure, but I'm not sure what that score measures. And so I think for us, the jury is out on whether benchmarking has value other than value to the landlord. And it's not clear to us, and the jury is still out, I would say, on what the score measures. The score alone doesn't tell me, if I walk by the building and read it, how the building uses energy, how it uses energy on a per unit basis, and whether it's using that energy well, regardless of whether the score is high or low. We do understand from conversations with several of our customers, large customers with either highly rated LEED buildings or Energy Star buildings, that they will get a low score. So I don't know what that means. I think also for smaller landlords, it was, on owners, it was more difficult to comply. So it's unclear how they characterized their data when they did comply. Again, you have a problem of what is it you're measuring and what data did you use? So there may be value. We will, we'll certainly use it like others will use it to market. There's value there. But in terms of what it's really telling us and what it will tell you about managing operations, I'm not sure we know that, and I'm not sure we will know that until we understand more about the correlation between those scores and other measures of energy use and perhaps energy efficiency.
Anybody else want to address that?
Sure. I'm not going to miss the chance to address the big question. So let me. Good morning, everyone. It's really terrific to be here. It's a fantastic panel and audience. And thank you, Laurie, for local hero, clearly on a trajectory to becoming a global hero for all the work that you've done and led here in New York with your colleagues. Actually, in the spirit of the event, let me disclose that Laurie and I are longtime co-conspirators. We have this deal where I come up from Philadelphia and talk about all the things Philadelphia has learned from New York. And far less frequently, she'll come down to Philadelphia and talk about how interested New York is in what's going on in Philadelphia now. But in terms of this large question about what the value is, let me also note that GPIC, the Greater
We've
Philadelphia.
always maintained an interest in our sixth borough.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, actually, this is something contested, but I believe in my column in the Philadelphia Daily News, as the coiner of that phrase, I'm flattered by that appellation, believe me. So I have no problem with that. The jury is absolutely still out on this. I've had, not just in terms of what exactly we're measuring and so on, but also in terms of our ability to fully implement this as a strategy. I've had more than one red-faced building owner in Philadelphia insist that a fully realized benchmarking regime in Philadelphia is a taking. Precisely if it works, it would be a taking. Now, he's wrong about that. But that's kind of the starting point for a lot of this conversation. On the more technical side of what it is the measures are providing for us, I think there's this balancing means test that we have to acknowledge and confront, which is the poverty rate is lousy too. Right? We're constantly talking about improving it, and we actually just recently made some tweaks. But in the full absence of any of these measures, there's so much room for improvement that I think we all endorse the idea of beginning this as long as we recognize that it's going to be continuously improved, and that the stakes need to rise that rest on the measure in accordance with our improved accuracy of what we're doing, and starting off slowly on that. So let's stop with that.
I want to address one of the things that Rebecca brought up, and I think it's very interesting when you look at the data, and we have the luxury of talking about it without showing the cards yet, but wait till mid-April. You start to see the signatures. Even though we know the data is dirty, we're starting to see the familiar signatures of the various quartiles and the bell-shaped curves of usage and so forth that lead us to believe that it's a pretty good effort for the first year. And it's starting to show us, those groups that are in those top quartiles, and starting to give us a sense of the magnitude of energy that could start to be saved when you look at this across a broad number of buildings. And I don't know how many of you have read the Deutsche Bank study, but that Deutsche Bank study looks at 230 some multifamily buildings in the city of New York, and plots how energy reductions that are realizable tend to follow pretty clearly the amount of energy used. So our benchmarking, by looking at those top quartiles, is really giving us a very accurate map, or seems to, combined with the Deutsche Bank study, seems to be giving us a nice map of where the targets can be, certainly in the multifamily sector. So to answer, in a very preliminary way, some of the questions that Rebecca's pulled out, I think the data is starting to show us give us some clues. I want to broaden this out. Discussions so far have generally focused on the big cities, Washington, San Francisco, New York, now potentially Philly. But we have Ron here from the state of New York, and I know he's been thinking about how this might roll out statewide. And so I wanted him to talk a little bit about how he sees that happening.
While Mark comes from the 6th borough of New York, I come from the 7th, which is the rest of New York State. There is a little bit more to the state of New York than the city, and one of my responsibilities is to create a regulatory framework for building construction that works throughout the state, and this is a particular challenge that we face in creating an enlightened society that is going to buy into the proposition that we're all talking about. There are a lot of folks that are still skeptical about this whole proposition of sustainability and energy conservation. And we've seen it in resistance at the local level, at the county level, at the regional level. And so the question that I have in my mind is, how do we take that next step? How do we take a jump to the next plateau? And I think probably the key to that is going to be simplicity. Finding a mechanism that allows for a relatively simple process that the building owner can understand, can place value in, and can then make into a long-term process that they can participate in. And so we've worked with the city here on many fronts from a regulatory standpoint in creating building codes. The city's had its own building code for many years, but recently moved to the national model codes, and that's something that the state has done as well. And there's something that I see as a potential for moving forward, using a consistent framework for developing the data, for collecting the data, and for making a process that people can understand and participate in.
Mark, do you have any thoughts from, I know the GPIC is not just about Philadelphia, it's about the counties that surround it as well. And so have you all looked at all in terms of broadening benchmarking throughout those more or less urban situations?
The short answer is yes. And let me just say, whereas Chuck Leitner, one of the organizers of this, is both the trustee of my university and an overseer of my school, and therefore I'm happy my name tag says University of Pennsylvania. Let me also say, not just in the hearing of Cody Taylor and Richard and others from DOE, that GPIC is, for those of you who don't know, is one of the 3 funded energy hubs. Ours is the Energy Efficient Buildings Hub from the Department of Energy. And so I don't know much about finance. I know the difference between hard money and soft money, but I'm very grateful for our soft money right now as well. And so DOE is the sponsor of a lot of this GPIC work, which refers to a 10-county, 5 in Pennsylvania and 5 in New Jersey, regional market that we're seeking to transform. And so for us, that market transformation for the very specific commercial retrofit space is about increasing the supply of available solutions, technical and financial, in that market. It's very market specific. The interesting hypothesis is not can you do it everywhere, but can you do it anywhere? We'll think about portability later, while accelerating the demand for those solutions in that regional market. Right? So that's what we're about in that very specific space. So whereas Philadelphia, the core city of that regional market, is often the wedge or perhaps the hammer for a number of those innovations, all of the stuff has to operate. It's really part of the maintained hypothesis of this hub, that stuff has a cluster or regional market organization that we're also trying to leverage. So in terms of disclosure particularly, whereas we appear on track for having, by summer, passed local ordinance, very much modeled on New York and on other jurisdictions, but really on New York's, that will begin the process of benchmarking and disclosure in the city proper. The idea is that because of some of the portfolios, because of some of the relationships with BOMA and other organizations, that will probably facilitate some voluntary work in the larger regional market, perhaps leading eventually to either county-based or perhaps state legislation that will undergird that. Now, another kind of institutional reality that helps support the kind of the regional scale-up of these kinds of efforts is the important role of the utilities. So the footprint, especially on both sides of the Delaware River, the footprint of the utilities is one of the key supports for making this a workable policy instrument to begin with. So one of the things, for example, and I'll stop with this, one of the things that we're working on the Pennsylvania side is which will apply both to the implementation at the city scale of the original ordinance, but then hopefully help facilitate the scale up to a regional market, is working with PECO, our electric utility, to do both the automatic download into Portfolio Manager, which greatly facilitates the actual implementation of this benchmarking, but also to try to work with PECO and the PUC in Pennsylvania to try to get the electric utility credit for our energy efficient resource standard known in Pennsylvania as Act 129, actually get credit for the cost, and therefore rate recovery, for the costs associated with supporting building owners in the automatic data download and populating of Portfolio Manager.
So, since they're captive here, what can Department of Energy do to help the localities do this? And maybe a parallel question is, you know, what's the role for tailoring this to individual communities versus, you know, the need for standards and, as Ron was saying, sort of plug and play, ease and uniformity. And maybe Cliff, who's seen probably the broadest number of ordinances, might kind of.
Well, I can say that in dealing with large portfolio owners, big companies that own portfolios of buildings around the country, they say over and over again, you know, we have varying feelings about these laws, but the worst thing from our perspective would be to have 50 very different sets of laws in 50 states that we would just knowing how to comply with a law in one state wouldn't help you very much in complying with laws in other states. And I think that there's some real value in standardization. And so I think the end point is probably has to be a high level of standardization. On the other hand, though, you know, these are early days, as Mark says, and so there is value for experimentation also to see how different approaches to the same problem work, and then hopefully to coalesce around one or two of the most successful solutions to that. DOE is doing great work in terms of supporting the cities and states that are doing this. I think Cody's going to be talking later today about their SEED. It's a infrastructure, a data backend. You know, New York City is going to be putting all of, and these other cities are going to be putting all of these Energy Star ratings online for the world to see. And then, more importantly, I think we hope that that data will get picked up by CoStar and by other real estate services that are routinely used when people are considering what properties to lease or buy. So that really gets it into the transaction. And so it's important, regardless the sort of details about minimum square footage that apply or how you're going to disclose or whatever, it's important that to the extent that everyone's capturing data, they capture it in a common format that's easy to share, that's easy for the CoStars of the world to capture and input into their systems. And so DOE is doing great work on that. Mark talked about the importance of having whole building data. In order to, say, Energy Star benchmark a building, you do need to have the energy consumption from every meter in that building, and that's surprisingly difficult. The building owners don't have access to all the tenant meters, and it's really a very difficult chore to go to a large number of tenants and try and get them all to sign a waiver to provide access to that data. And that's why what Con Ed is doing is so important to the success of Local Law 84, and it's really important anywhere you want to have this kind of a law for the utility to provide that whole building energy data, aggregated data. And I think DOE can be very helpful in helping to push that forward, helping to make the case. I think many utilities don't even realize that their customers really want this, that their large building customers don't want this. It's very wonky, it's down in the weeds, but it's critical. And so I think DOE and the White House can really shine a light on this important issue, recognize utilities that are a leader in this area. The National Association of Regulatory Commissioners has actually endorsed the idea that utilities should be providing aggregate data, whole building energy data, to help their customers become more energy efficient. And that was actually an initiative, the first initiative by a group called the Data Access and Transparency Alliance, DATA, energydataalliance.org. And my group is one of the 4 founding organizations. The other 3 are the U.S. Green Building Council, the Real Estate Roundtable, and BOMA. So it's very much a environmental organizations and building owners coming together and saying this is something important, this is something that we want. But it's a long-term process, and I think federal leadership could be very helpful. Even though utilities are regulated at typically the state level, federal leadership could still help to move things more quickly.
You know, and so much of what we know about all of this is because of Cliff and IMT, and one of the things I'm going to draw out is based on the work that they've done, is that we have kind of a nice natural experiment on this too, given kind of the historical institutional accident of Chicago and the way master metering gets done there. Chicago is actually one of the places that's got one of the best data sets already. We don't kind of have all the access to it that we want, but that's got, you know, fantastic data that I think potentially could probably help us model the best way to do all this stuff too, in some sense. So, because of the relationship with the utilities and the physical infrastructure of the city.
Yeah, I think DOE's role is going to be particularly critical. I think this is especially true for small-scale construction. Probably the single most transformational event that occurred in small-scale construction to promote energy conservation was the advent of ResCheck and ComCheck, the software programs that DOE developed that designers can use to represent energy compliance. And even the small building inspector in a town of 5,000 individuals that really doesn't know a lot about energy can require or can ask for a ResCheck or a ComCheck analysis. And that's something that had never happened before. And so the question is, can DOE help us to create BenchCheck or whatever that standard will be that creates a common denominator for all building owners.
One of the issues that has been an elephant in the room is, of course, the issue of privacy of energy data, and what is the role that's appropriate here? How do we balance these various goods, the role of privacy and then the need for in general to know what's happening with energy in order to start to tackle these big common problems? Does anybody want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think privacy clearly is very important, and I think it's important that people pushing for energy efficiency understand how important privacy is and make that clear to privacy advocates. I think sometimes we live in two very different worlds, and there's not enough cross-communication. To give the extreme example, and privacy advocates really worry about this very much, if you had real-time access to someone's utilities, so you could know in real time how many kilowatts they're using, then you could have a pretty good sense of when they get home, because they turn on the lights, their system comes on, that sort of thing. There's all kinds of big brother implications that would come in from knowing exactly when someone's individual unit was consuming energy. Now, at the other end of this spectrum, aggregate data for a whole building, say a whole apartment building, that on a monthly basis, really, to my mind, there is maybe sort of small privacy interest, but I think it's a very small privacy interest, and I think it's very much overwhelmed by the importance of the building owners having access to that data in order to be able to understand how efficient their buildings are and endeavor to make them more efficient. And right now there are a hodgepodge of privacy protections, and the utilities in general are very conservative on this, as you would expect a large corporation to be. They don't want to be sued, and so they're very careful on this. But at the same time, I think the privacy advocates would say, if you just look at the law, in many cases there's really not much in the way of privacy protections at all, and the privacy requirements haven't been adapted to this new reality of smart grid and the possibility of collection of data in real time. So I think ultimately what is needed is you bring together the utilities, the privacy advocates, the energy efficiency advocates, and others, and you strike a reasonable balance where you say, okay, there needs to be strong protections for very sensitive data, and then for data which is much less sensitive but still very valuable for understanding the efficiency of the building, we need to have good access to that data, easy access, get it to the building owners, get it into Energy Star Portfolio Manager. As Mark said, the Chicago example is a very successful example. It's very user-friendly. Their building owners are very happy with it. And I haven't heard of any real privacy concerns around it. So I think that the good news here is that if we approach this carefully, if we have good communications among all the interested parties, I think we can come up with a very good solution. What I worry about is that there will be releases of smart grid data, compromise of privacy, and there'll be an overreaction, and we'll lose all access to this important data, even the data that's not sensitive.
Anybody else have any thoughts about, anybody else have any thoughts about data privacy issues? So, I guess, what about lessons? Well, one question I think that is something that comes up a lot in these policy discussions is benchmarking requirements, yes, but how much of the output should be public? What is the benefit of public disclosure? Maybe we'd like to hear from Mark a little bit about what the discussion has been in Philadelphia on that, and you know, what some of the benefits are seen one way or the other.
Well, in terms of, and the Philadelphia ordinance is still in play, right? So it's still under discussion. But in terms of the disclosure aspect of this, the city is currently planning to follow, again, New York's lead, using the advantages of backwardness, following New York's lead on starting first with the disclosure of public building performance, right? So to try to show, hopefully, to try to show that we're maybe just at least average, right? And that it's not that scary, and that it works, and exactly what it might look like 2 or 3 years later when public disclosure begins to obtain, so that that same kind of opening up of, you know, pulling back the veil, but starting first with public buildings. The Philadelphia ordinance currently would only apply to commercial properties. So there, you know, it obviates a lot of this discussion related to the residential and privacy concerns and so on. And multifamily is actually under debate about which way it's going to be treated. So we treat it at GPIC as a commercial property, but in terms of the disclosure ordinance, it's not clear. So, of course, what's the point, right? The objective of all this is there is this, you know, magic wand, right, of overcoming the market failure with the appropriate information that allows prices to fluctuate in a way that responds to the value proposition. And so that's, you know, ultimately that is the idea, that interests that are being mobilized around a disclosure ordinance in Philadelphia are, we were talking earlier, I believe it was Richard was talking earlier about who's the buyer. Who's the buyer for energy efficient investments that get placed into a building? Well, there's of course another set of buyers too, right? There are the buyers of tenanted space, the renters. There are the buyers of these buildings and so on. And so part of what we're activating what the city is activating in Philadelphia in terms of their interests is that there are a lot more occupants of built space than there are owners of built space in the commercial sector. And so treating this as a buyer of space interest is part of what happens with one of these disclosure ordinances, so that those choices can be better informed, much like the food labeling and the automobile labeling that has been referenced by Constantine and Cliff earlier. So that's really, you know, that's the kind of the grail, obviously. In the policy markets and behavior task at GPIC, we have this motto: Planto is immutabilis, planto is vilis, tunc planto is mandatum. Make it hipper, make it cheaper, then make it mandatory, right? And disclosure feeds in all of these goals and all of these techniques that we're trying to apply to bring about market transformation. And for us, disclosure is, especially in the early years, less about make it mandatory. It's actually more about make it hipper, right? It's more about rewarding the good performers than it is about punishing the bad performers. And eventually mandatory will only be about reforming the bad performers, not punishing them. But disclosure is very much about creating that price effect that the good performers do not now receive to the full extent they deserve. So that, for us, that's what disclosure is about.
Having said, you know, the jury's out, should it come to pass that, in fact, benchmarking does drive behavior in a way that makes people address inefficiencies in their building in a more regular fashion over time, that's a very good thing. It drives efficiency. And in that sense, you know, hipper is good, actionable is better from our perspective. So it's unclear to us whether benchmarking will drive real audits and then retrocommissioning. In New York, there are laws to that. In other places, there are not. But if it indeed does, that, from a utilities perspective, has some interesting consequences, which are, largely good in New York City, not necessarily universally. For us, we forecast demand side savings into our capital plans, and we do that. We do that with a lot of uncertainty, so we take a lot of discounts. We can look at billing. We can get a feel for that when we've done an efficiency project with a customer. How much does their use change over time? How much does their demand change over time? To the extent that we see patterns of behavior, particularly in certain networks, we can look at those geographic areas and decide to build differently. But those are very, very long-term kinds of effects, but they could be very real types of effects. And those are the types of effects that, in fact, return to ratepayers value for the surcharges on the bill, to the extent that any given ratepayer does not, in fact, participate in a ratepayer funding efficiency program. It is only when you somehow incorporate those savings into a long-term plan and into a rate base that ratepayers as a whole benefit. And so you can see, if it in fact works, that there's sort of a path to some real long-term gain there. But it's not a couple-year thing. That's kind of the 10-year, 5-year, 10-year minimum course.
Mark touched on this, but I think it's a point that bears repeating, and that's the role of government. At some point, benchmarking, the hypothesis is that benchmarking will become mandatory. By the time that phase occurs, government needs to have set the example. We need to create benchmarking standards for government-owned facilities to show that that we are first and foremost the stewards, and we are asking our citizens to join us in becoming stewards as well. And I think if we do it that way, we're going to have a much greater buy-in. I think it's going to be much more successful. If we, at some point, if government decides to mandate benchmarking but is not playing by the same rules, then we're going to have the same problems that we've had historically. So I think it's very important.
Just to touch a little bit on the city's own benchmarking, we've seen some things. Of course, there are some really bad performers in the city's stock of buildings, and they're all posted, so you can see them. We have almost 1,300 schools, and every one of them is posted, and there are some efficient ones, and there are some that need a lot of work. What has that meant for us managing that large portfolio? Well, it's meant that the Department of Education knows which are the schools that they should be targeting first. So it's given them incredibly valuable information on where the biggest targets are and so forth. So I think by not being afraid of finding out what's really happening, the city really serves to benefit. And so we see it that way with our portfolio. We also can see some very interesting things, that our libraries apparently are performing better than the national average. Our police and fire stations, not so good. What's going on with that? We don't know yet, but before we did the benchmarking, we would have had no way to know any of that. And so it's kind of like lifting this veil off this whole area where we literally knew almost nothing a year ago. So any other lessons learned that anybody in the panel wants to bring up at this point?
One thing I would say is I think that you in New York have done a very good job of engaging the real estate community and the utilities and others. I think it's very important that you get all the stakeholders together to really understand what their concerns are, make sure everyone sort of understands their goals, where they're coming from, and design policies accordingly. And I think that hopefully New York will be an example of a real win-win, that hopefully Local Law 84 and the rest of the greener, greater building laws will not only reduce the city's carbon footprint, but will help position the city as a green city. And the city actually really is a green city, especially because so many people walk or take the subway or something to work. But that hasn't really been widely recognized. And I think to the extent that that becomes widely recognized, I think it makes the city even more of an attraction to some of the creative class, the people that already, so many of them are here in New York. And that benefit can be even greater to other cities that don't have all of the assets that New York has. So I think that this has the potential to really be an economic driver, a driver of new jobs, of increased property values, of a stronger economy. And there's a real win-win here because the fundamentals are that, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about this later today, there are a lot of untapped investment opportunities in our buildings, both by retrofitting them or just operating them better. The return on investment from those investments are huge. And the question is, why haven't those investments been occurring at the rate that sort of a neoclassical economist would expect? Well, there are a lot of answers, a lot of impediments. But one of the principal impediments is this lack of information, or the view that, if the market doesn't have this information, if I make this improvement and then I sell my building, I'm not going to be able to capture the value of my investment when I go to sell the building. And so having better information goes a long way to address that real market failure.
Well, I was just going to say another lesson I think from New York that you've helped other jurisdictions, the rest of us, is that in addition to the market failure of information asymmetries, there's also the market failure of transaction costs. And there's a lot of I've never heard anyone from New York say this, but there's a lot of, kind of imputation to the politics of greater buildings and going for 5 bills and ending up with 4 and being very comprehensive and so on. And I think that in Philadelphia, because of the way you've softened up so much of the interest groups, you and other jurisdictions who have been the gazelles on this, is that there's just it's a lot easier to sell everywhere else in the country. Watching the diffusion of this policy instrument to other jurisdictions, we're at this tipping point on the Sternpike theorem where it's going to take off and probably diffuse too rapidly, if anything. But you've so softened up national interests related to these concerns that I think that in a place like Philadelphia, there's a smaller list of bills that are being advanced because nobody wants to scare anybody with other things like mandatory audits or something. I mean, you've softened the system up so much that in Philadelphia, the political calculation, and I think elsewhere as well, is that you can get benchmarking and disclosure just by asking for benchmarking and disclosure. So that's, I think, one of the emerging policy analysis lessons from this.
I think one of the things that's going to play out over time is how well do these different packages work. And our feeling right now is that the more ambitious package actually works better in the long run. And that's, I think, this understanding of the role of the consultants, and that because there was more work to be had down the road through the audits and the retro-commissioning and the lighting upgrades and the sub-metering, that they wanted to get their foot in the door through benchmarking. And so they went after those projects, and because they did that, we have at least 60% of our benchmarking so we went from 1 million buildings to 16,000 properties to 40 consultants literally benchmarked 60% of those properties, or quality improvement a lot easier. So that's a kind of interesting thing, and I think watching how these packages play out over time is going to be extremely interesting too.
So can I make one comment on that? I guess, the interesting thing about that is that as all of those requirements become mandatory, they become, at least as efficiency regulation and policy stands now, ineligible for efficiency subsidies, right? You don't pay to bring people to code, you pay to get them to exceed code. And, right now, at least in New York State and really in many states, efficiency programs usually include some kind of a subsidized audit, reimbursement for technical studies, and those will all be off limits once they are mandatory, at least as the rules of the game are currently in play.
One of the things that I think we were very good at here in New York early on was kind of cataloging the building resources that we had and the energy use that we had, and that we've been able to make a lot of progress because we've had a lot of quantitative information on that and been able to act efficiently on that. What we haven't had a lot of information about or much study of, and this goes back to what Richard was talking about, are the people. And I think, I know Urban Green is now starting to really look at who are the players in New York City that make the big decisions that impact all of these things, and how many of them are there in each sector, and how many firms, how many individuals are leasing attorneys, are building operators, are managing agents, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all of these players who act on this system, and we've just begun to even ask the question of who they are, much less what determines their choices of action, too. So that's going to be a very, very interesting thing, new terrain that we're starting to enter, I think, as a city.
Yeah, we're doing.
In terms of doing the math.
Yeah, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're working with Jones Lang LaSalle on the owner side and Studley on the tenant side, looking at the 50 big expiring leases in the market, in the region, the GPIC regional market, to try to kind of engage those transactions and learn from them. And yeah, no, that's right. You got to get down into this behavioral.
Yeah.
Are any of you working with building engineers education? As an asset manager, I can say I want to have a green building, I want to go for LEED certification, but I don't speak the language of the building engineers on a day-to-day basis, and I have not found a good national education program to tell people, I'll pay for the classes so that you can understand what it is you do in your buildings that will have an impact, because otherwise it's lost in translation. Are any of you working with BOMA or other organizations on that?
Go ahead. We are. All right. Well, yeah, we do work with BOMA. BOMA has a good program called BEEP, Building Energy Efficiency Program. It's an online program mostly, so it's very inexpensive, and it's good for people that learn that way. There's also a very good program called the Building Operator Certification Program. There's Building Operator Certification being run out of CUNY here, Michael Bobker's shop, here in New York City. Building Operator Certification is a program that started on the West Coast. It's most common in the Pacific Northwest and California. I think it's spreading around the country. And they train building operators in how to operate their own buildings. They test them and how well they know their own buildings that they currently are operating. So it's very hands-on. It's very actionable, real. And DOE is doing some work in terms of coming up with something in between sort of building operator certification just for the building operators and retro commissioning, which takes a higher level of expertise from a third party coming in, something they're calling building retuning. And look for more on that shortly. There's actually a DOE solicitation that just went out, an RFP offering money to help basically community colleges, I think, provide training to building operators, $1.3 million to be, that's not that much money when it's spread across the country, but there'll be a few awards that add up to $1.3 million. That RFP will be open, I think, for a few more weeks. So there are good resources out there. But I think the reality is that in most of the country, most building operators are trained in-house by the company that hires them, and without the benefit of sort of a national curriculum or anything else, which works pretty well in some cases and not so well in others, and there's a lot of room for improvement.
And I would say there's also, Certified Energy Manager designation, which is an important program, not quite that. And to give credit, Local 32, BJ really has a great training program for, on the multifamily side for its uniformed, for the uniformed staff, primarily the supers. They do a great job.
Yeah,
There have been other groups that have also stepped into the breach here in New York. We need more auditors. The AEE is providing classes for auditors in New York City. We need a lot more people trained in retro commissioning. The Building Commissioning Association We'll be providing 11 classes over the next year and a half or so here in New York City. And also in terms of benchmarking, the Association of Energy Affordability has done trainings, as well as CUNY, now with some assistance from Institute of Market Transformation, has been running a hotline. So there have been a lot of efforts to give training and information in these somewhat new and evolving fields. I would say that one of the things that we have targeted and have been talking with Department of Energy about is, standardizing the certifications for these, because there's a bewildering array of programs and certifications, and they're not all apples to apples. And as this goes to scale, that becomes increasingly difficult for jurisdictions and others to maneuver what's credible, which of these things are ANSI certified, and so forth and so on. So, that developing that, is something that we see as an appropriate role for the federal government to assist in raising those standards and making them clearer.
One other thing, as Laurie says, there is this thicket of certifications. If you are interested in seeing sort of information and how they relate, we have done an effort to catalog as many of them as we could find, and describe sort of some of the minimum requirements for them, how they compare with each other. If you go to our website, imt.org, you go under programs, and you go to, I think it's commercial energy certifications, you'll see it's a list of 30 or so, 20-some certifications from around, mostly national certifications, and they relate to building operators, building energy modelers, building auditors, and how they relate to each other.
And the other thing I would add to that is that having done our homework, having gone to the IMT website and read up on stuff, we're starting to implement this. There's a whole team at GPEC of the 5 teams. One of them is workforce. And so working with the trades in particular, because there's some very interesting jurisdictional issues here that arise as well, working with the trades to implement and the community colleges and Delaware Tech and some of the other local universities to try to begin to implement and raise some of these competencies and these curricula in our particular market setting.